The atmosphere in Japan after its unconditional surrender to the Allied powers on August 15, 1945, was one of shock, devastation, and profound uncertainty. The surrender marked the end of a long and brutal conflict and the beginning of a difficult period of occupation, recovery, and transformation. Many Japanese people were indeed under the impression that their military was performing well, even in the face of overwhelming odds. This was largely due to strict government censorship and propaganda that painted a rosy picture of the war effort. So the shock they received from Japan's surrender was enormous.
Shock and disbelief. Unexpected defeat. The announcement of Japan's surrender by Emperor Hirohito in a radio broadcast known as the Jewel Voice broadcast was the first time many Japanese people had ever heard their emperor speak. The defeat came as a profound shock to a nation that had been told to expect victory or a decisive, honorable battle to the end. At that time, countless Japanese people took to the streets and wept profusely as they listened to the emperor's surrender speech. Devastation of the atomic bombings. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, along with the Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan, played a decisive role in the surrender. The scale of destruction, especially from the atomic bombs, was unprecedented. The bombings left cities in ruins, caused immense suffering, and highlighted the futility of continuing the war. Many innocent Japanese people became victims of the military's reckless pursuit of war. Propaganda and reality. For years, Japanese propaganda had depicted the war as a struggle for survival and honor. Many civilians and soldiers were prepared to fight to the last breath. The sudden surrender was not only a defeat, but also a collapse of the narrative they had been living under, leading to confusion and disbelief.
Despair and devastation. Physical destruction. Much of Japan was in ruins. Cities across the country had been heavily bombed, leaving millions of people homeless. Infrastructure, industry, and transportation were severely damaged. In addition to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama had been devastated by conventional bombings. Economic collapse. The economy was in shambles. Factories were destroyed, supply chains were broken, and basic goods like food, clothing, and medicine were in short supply. Many people were starving, and the black market became a crucial source of survival. Loss of life. Japan had suffered enormous human losses, with millions of military and civilian casualties. Many families were grieving the loss of loved ones, and there was a sense of deep sorrow that permeated the country.
Humiliation and uncertainty. Loss of national pride. The surrender was seen as a national humiliation. The Japanese military had built its reputation on notions of honor, strength, and loyalty to the emperor. The surrender not only marked a military defeat, but also felt like a loss of dignity and honor for many Japanese. Uncertainty about the future. With the war over, the future of Japan was unclear. There were fears of a harsh occupation, with rumors circulating about potential punishments and the treatment of Japanese leaders and citizens by the Allied forces. The presence of foreign soldiers on Japanese soil added to this sense of vulnerability and apprehension.
The Emperor's role and the acceptance of defeat. The Emperor's radio broadcast. Emperor Hirohito's announcement was a pivotal moment. He explained the decision to surrender as necessary to endure the unendurable, framing it as a means to save lives and preserve what remained of Japan. For many, hearing the Emperor's voice was a deeply emotional experience, as he was considered a divine figure and a symbol of national unity. Respect for the Emperor. Despite the defeat, many Japanese people retained their reverence for the Emperor. His message helped soften the blow of surrender by presenting it as a noble and selfless act. This helped the people come to terms with the reality of defeat, though it did not erase the pain.
Relief and a desire for peace. End of suffering. While there was widespread despair, there was also a sense of relief that the war had finally ended. Japan had been at war for nearly a decade, beginning with the invasion of China in 1937. The war had brought immense suffering, not only to the Japanese people, but also to those in the countries they occupied. Many Japanese were exhausted and relieved that the bloodshed had come to an end. Hopes for a better future. Some saw the end of the war as an opportunity to rebuild and start anew. Japan had been militarized for years, and now there was a possibility of a future without constant conflict. The occupation authorities, led by General Douglas MacArthur, promised to help rebuild Japan, which offered a glimmer of hope amid the devastation.
The American occupation, 1945 to 1952. Occupation forces arrive. The arrival of Allied occupation forces, primarily American, brought a mix of fear, curiosity, and cooperation. Many Japanese had been led to believe that the occupation would be brutal, but the initial period of the occupation was more lenient than expected. General MacArthur sought to manage Japan's transition peacefully, focusing on rebuilding rather than punishment. Reforms and reconstruction. The occupation brought significant changes to Japanese society, including land reform, democratization, and the introduction of a new constitution. Japan was demilitarized, and the emperor's status was transformed from a divine ruler to a symbolic figurehead. These changes laid the foundation for Japan's post-war recovery and modernization.
Rebuilding and recovery. Economic challenges. The early years after the war were marked by severe economic difficulties. Food shortages were a constant issue, and many people struggled to find work. However, the occupation forces provided food aid, and the government began programs to stimulate the economy. Focus on education and industry. The Japanese government, with the support of the Allies, focused on rebuilding the economy through industrialization and education. The emphasis was on creating a peaceful, democratic society that could rebuild and recover from the war's devastation. Emergence of a new Japan. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, Japan began to show signs of recovery. The U.S. occupation ended in 1952, and Japan regained its sovereignty. In the following decades, Japan would experience rapid economic growth, transforming itself into one of the world's leading economies. Japan's high economic growth in the 1950s was significantly influenced by the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. When the war began, the United States needed a supply base in the region, and Japan, being close to the Korean peninsula, became a key logistical hub for the U.S. military. During the war, the U.S. military placed large orders for goods such as uniforms, vehicles, and other equipment, which helped to revive Japan's industries.
Cultural shifts and reflection. Questioning the past. The surrender forced a national reflection on Japan's militaristic past and the causes of the war. While some clung to traditional beliefs, others began to question the decisions that had led to Japan's involvement in the conflict and the devastation it caused. Desire for peace. The experience of defeat, combined with the horrors of war, created a strong pacifist sentiment within Japan. The new constitution, drafted under the supervision of the Allied forces, included Article 9, which renounced war as a means of resolving international disputes. This commitment to peace has been a defining feature of Japan's post-war identity. The period following Japan's surrender was a time of profound transformation. The nation had to come to terms with the loss of its empire, the devastation of war, and the challenge of rebuilding from the ground up. Amid the despair, there was also resilience, adaptability, and hope, which allowed Japan to emerge from the ruins to become a peaceful and prosperous nation in the decades that followed. Thank you for watching the video, After Japan's Defeat, provided by History and Current Events. This is Gina and Sarah, Lily, Bill, Brian, and Tony have also contributed so far as narrators. Thank you.